Good morning, good afternoon. Hope this finds you well, guys. It's Sunday morning for me. And as I've already explained to you, if you're watching this video, we are trying to do a little bit something different this week where we're going to have one thing going on all week in class live and this thing going on all week while you are at home. The two events I want to get to today are the Great Awakening and the Zenger trial. And I want us to consider how we can reconcile these events and what they tell us about American culture in the 1700s with the institution of slavery that is running rampant in the colonies. Um, let's start talking about culture because there's not a lot of it going on. Now, we are 100+ years removed from the establishment of Jamestown. So I would venture to say that in the early 1700s, the cities, as it were, are probably more advanced than you are imagining in your mind. Um, we've got a picture here, an illustration of what some place might look like. Having said that, it's not exactly, and I'm talking about any of the 13 colonies, a mecca of culture. Certainly within Boston and Philadelphia in particular, there's some development of some culture, but America isn't exactly renowned for, in the early 1700s, education, languages, and arts, and literature, and that sort of thing. Um, they're not even particularly well renowned for being religious at this point in history. Okay. And I'm talking again the early 1700s prior to an event called the Great Awakening, which is a call for America to return to religion, but it's a unique call in its nature. So, setting the stage for that conversation, right? We understand that there were serious religious intentions among many of the American colonists in the first couple generations. In particular, the Puritans, the Congregationalists up in New England, the separatist Puritans, right, who lived in the congregations, who would come together in the towns and have this spirit of direct democracy, by the way. Those who did not separate from the Church of England uh, became the Anglicans that we see typically in like that New York, New Jersey area, um, and further south as well. Maryland itself, right, per the Maryland Act of Toleration, is established essentially for all intents and purposes as a Catholic colony. So there's absolutely some religious intentionality in the American colonies. But over time, some of that had begun to erode. My theory is that Americans still, even though it's 100 years and the cities are probably more than you imagine, it is still kind of a tough living to make in this new world. We are a couple generations in, and it certainly has gotten better since Jamestown and constant battles with Native Americans. But that's still happening. And there is still people, dying of disease and so on, and even in the cities where we'll talk about live a little bit of kind of the economic disparity you'll see in the colonies. Regardless, uh, the churches take note and preachers take note of the decline of religion in America, and they begin to sweep the nation in kind of a series of revival tent, these revivals they call them, right? Um, and call Americans back to religion. And new denominations, new Christian denominations pop up and down the East Coast. One of the most famous preachers is a guy by the name of Jonathan Edwards, and I've got his speech, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, linked here. If someone understands that, I would love you to do some document analysis and tell me more about it. I'm not sure that I get that speech, but I get the fact that guys like Edwards and Whitefield as I said, are running these revivals, and they're calling people back to the church. And what they're doing, they're calling people back to the church to have more of an inner experience, a personal calling to God and to church. And it's not necessarily to the traditional churches. In fact, what happens, as I said earlier, these denominations pop up because Americans are willing to question the church when they are swept up in this movement, um, because they are a people that had already been willing to question the government, to dissent among themselves, to participate in kind of this American debate tradition that starts as early as the colonies. And when the movement for denominationism begins, there is a break from the traditional churches. Um, you're going to see a number of effects of this that I think are still with us today. Just in this area, you can think of obviously Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, Baptist churches, and so on. And that's kind of a hallmark, I think, of American religion today. This freedom of religion that really might be better attributed to the Great Awakening than it is, as we had already talked about with, the Puritans and in New England. But it's interesting how this American spirit of freedom uh, serves this religious movement really well too, and still affects American society today. I'd like you to not hear me talk about it right now, but for about 10 minutes, please. If you like this guy, he's great. John Green, Crash Course U.S. History. He's going to be talking about the Great Awakening and what it says about American culture during this time. Some other things that are going on that I think you can draw some comparisons between, and that we will be covering next week. But listen to John Green and the Great Awakening, and then come back to me. Guys, this YouTube link is on the bulletin. It is on this presentation right here. Check it out. Come back to me in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that, got to hear a different voice, and I think you will see that there is some elements beginning to form um, about American culture, at least as it pertains to politics. This spirit of freedom that American colonists have always had. Um, it comes from the tradition that the colonists largely had to fend for themselves in developing colonial governments. And by the late 18th century, all 13 colonies had developed some form of democratic based government. Some as early, right, with the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is the nation's first representative democracy, and those type of institutions flourish. In fact, structurally, as it relates to government, all colonies have a bicameral, two-chambered legislature, like we still have today, right, with a House and a Senate. Um, Within that spirit of democracy too, much like we saw with the Great Awakening, there is a unique American spirit about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, as we just talked about. um, and these ideals developed, as I said, largely while being neglected by the mother country, Great Britain, right? And that's a concept we know as salutary neglect. Okay. Um, we'll talk more about that. And when we combine that with the economic theory of mercantilism, that the colonies exist just to make the mother nation wealthy, you'll come to a patented Galloway historical thesis that I've got coming for you when we're in class one day. All right. Um, but understand that there is this spirit of kind of democracy early on in the American colonies. Whether it's direct democracy up north in New England originally, or as I said, representative throughout, this is America. Okay, these are the cultures that are forming on a political basis, and when the British government steps away from being neglectful, okay, and tries to control like top down in what Americans will come to consider a tyrannical fashion. Um, we're going to build a long list of what it is that I like to say pisses the colonists off so much that they just have to declare independence. But I think it really starts with this, as I said earlier, unique spirit of American freedom. And then we're going to see the British government, again, no longer become neglectful, but become tyrannical. And you're going to see a number of instances where we can see that kind of play out. But I wanted to come back to the idea of that there is a unique spirit of American freedom at play here. It is certainly, I think, evident in the second significant event from the 1700s we're going to talk about today, which is the trial of Peter J. Zenger. Um, Zenger is a news publisher, and he is critical of the government, and he is sued and brought to court. And you are going to read a little bit about this instance in American history. And I want you to put in your notes what you think the significance of the Zenger decision is and what impact this would have on the development of American traditions. So, once again, you can pause me and go to this reading. It shouldn't take you that long. Try to answer some of these questions in your notes, then come back to me. We'll talk a little bit about it and keep on moving on, moving on. Okay. So I hope you're able to really get a good understanding of what happened in that trial. But you've got to understand that there is no American legal precedent being set here because we are not America yet. Okay. We don't have a court system that hands down legal precedent. However, as I write here, the trial has a huge impact because the colonists see the press as being very important to hold the government accountable. That tradition is absolutely evident in the founding of our nation, in the very First Amendment, in all the actions leading up to the Declaration of Independence. Americans have valued the watchdog role of the press on the government because we fear not information, we fear tyranny from the government. And the tradition is that the libel laws, okay, and this was the legal matter at stake in the Zenger trial, are structured in such a way to really favor a strong freedom of press. It's one of the most important American values, and I think the Zenger trial, in my humble opinion, begins to set the stage of why that is and when that ideal really takes root in the American psyche. Check out this video now, okay, which is also linked on the bulletin, also linked through the presentation, and is also somebody else talking about the Zenger trial. So you know that I'm not alone in this, I think. This is a guy, Kip Hughes, who does a lot of videos for the AP Gov curriculum, and just take some good information from the man. All right. Come back to me in a couple minutes. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one, but I honestly hope you got something out of it. Let's get ready to kind of close up class here. I'm going to ask you to do this in your notes. Just write like a paragraph. I want you to really kind of personalize this, though. reflect on the question, how do you think the colonists reconciled kind of this cognitive dissonance between movements like the Great Awakening, right, which in theory is a calling to God, right, and what that means, and calling for freedom from government tyranny, like we see in the Zenger trial? That there's certainly this terrific notion of freedom in America, and calls for more freedom and more independence and more questioning of authority. Um, and yet, we are a nation that is of slaves, a nation of slavery. Um, I want you to also check out. I've linked here. It might help you out. The origins of slavery article from Gilder Lehrman. But I'm looking for you to do a little bit of reflection um, in your notes. One paragraph. Let it rip. Let's go. That's what I got for you. Have a great day.